Shelter Afrique is the leading Pan-African institution dealing with housing, all housing-related issues. And most of the debate up until now has focused on home ownership and buying of homes and financing of home acquisition. So we think that since the biggest part of the African population, more than 80% of Africans actually don't own houses, they rent houses, the debate has focused too much about home ownership. So we think it's high time that we start talking about renting as a normal thing. So we organized this conference here together with our partner, Agence Francaise De Developpment, to initiate discussion around rental housing. So we've invited all the stakeholders involved, government, private developers, construction companies, to come here and talk about rental housing. We took Kenya first and foremost because we are based in Nairobi, but we think that with all the debate that's going on around home ownership in Kenya, because as you know, it's just as important here as it is everywhere else, we thought that ideally we are based here, we're located here, it is a prime theme in Kenya as well, so where else? That's why we put it here in Kenya. What we expect is we have created a forum for them to interact. We have a very interesting number of themes that have been put together for them to discuss and try to find solutions to. So we think that this will be a unique opportunity for them to actually not only stimulate debate amongst themselves, but also to address the key thing that we think today is holding back any topic, any discussion on rental housing. Because we all Africans have one dream, and that is to own a house. But we want to start with that. We want people to understand that it's okay to rent a house. You don't only have to own it, but it's also okay to rent a house. And by the way, renting a house could also be a step towards home ownership.
Well, Shelter Afrique is a company into housing development in Africa, and the Wema Bank, as a commercial bank, we are engaged in housing projects to bridge the housing deficit that we have all over Africa. So we thought that we should come in and talk to our partners and then look at other ways of making the partnership better, basically to provide more housing to Africans. At the end of this conference, I am expecting that I will meet new people, new developers, new companies that are financing housing in Africa, and generally deepen relationship even with our existing partners like Shelter Afrique.
I am expecting something of great magnitude in this conference, and I think this is the first conference that I've ever had. And I think it's going to do marvelous to us, especially to we investors. And I'm expecting, when I come from here, I'll go and invest on real estate management. And that's a reality. In fact, because that's what I was hoping for. That was my vision, and even my mission, I would rather say.
We at the Nairobi City County released our blueprint for housing in the city. The plan for implementation at the start of the first quarter of next year will be done through a public-private sector partnership model. It envisages the regeneration into a compact city, 800 hectares of urban space, of which 352 hectares will be developed by the private sector. The public component will comprise social housing projects and infrastructure development. The private sector is expected to provide at least 80,000 commercial housing units, with 20% of its space allocation set aside for light-scale industrial and business parks. This is just one of the ways we plan to ensure decent housing for our people. I'm very eager to hear the deliberations from this conference. As a county government, we are ready to engage with various experts in this field and chart a way forward. With those few remarks, I declare the 2014 African Housing Conference officially opened.
We can start to acknowledge that rental housing is a legitimate option to solving the housing deficit, not just in Kenya, but across Africa. The rental housing conversation is one that must be had, and is certainly one that the Jubilee government and the Ministry of Land, Housing and Urban Development is keen on having. Ladies and gentlemen, we should never limit ourselves when addressing any social problem, not just housing, to just one solution or just one policy recommendation. The housing conversation, for example, needs to be linked to solutions in rapid mass transport and social facilities and infrastructure. Ultimately, the task of government, and by extension society, is to find a number of solutions that will address our many problems. I commend Shelter Afrique for urging us to walk the road less traveled.
What is the role of government? Let us decide on a vision for housing in Africa, and let us work along those lines. Let us then draw on the experiences and the knowledge of other jurisdictions, so that when we come to talk about housing in Africa, the governments should know their role. They have to lead in terms of vision, strategy, and also resource.
Public sector has a tremendously important role in housing. But the reason that my institutions pushed privatization of housing, and many others have as well, is that no government has ever had the ability to meet demand, even at the very poorest end of or the base of the income pyramid, by building houses and giving them away or renting them out. And the stories of failure on that count are legion, and I've seen them in every region of the world.
I know what my variables are. When I start, I do not break ground until the math makes sense on paper. And that's what everybody needs to start thinking about. Let's stop pleading for government intervention. Politicians will never help us. They have never done it. They will not do it. They will never do it.
I'm personally interested in this sector because I believe this is another way of addressing the issue of mass housing. Now, what I've seen as I'm experiencing as an investment officer at Shelter Afrique is we have capacity issues in the sense that developers, my colleague here have talked about being a small-time developer. My feeling is there are too many of them.
What I've liked about the conference today is that we have had a lot of experiences from Europe, from USA, we've had experiences from Latin America, and one of the things that has really stood out for me is the critical role of governments in providing social housing for the citizens, especially the low-income citizens. And this, of course, has meant a lot for me as a director of housing, because it means that we cannot shy away from social housing. But I guess the critical issue for us is how do we provide social housing and at the same time be able to provide decent housing, which we are able to manage, considering the low levels of rent that are charged. Rental housing to many Western countries has actually been very key in addressing the housing shortage, because when you look at countries like Netherlands, most of the housing is actually private sector driven. It is actually rental housing. But I guess for us as Kenyans is to really try and address the issue of how do we leverage finance to be able to do the low-income social housing.
I think what stood out for me most was that the people who presented earlier, and they presented on situations in Europe and South America. And it seems that the problems that they experiences in those countries are the same problems that we experience here. So it's nothing unique even for us here. Secondly, which really stands out now when we speak about our own region, is that we have a large deficit of housing, especially for our younger families and for single people. So that deficit is what needs to be covered. And I think that's where lies the great opportunity for people like ourselves. I think which is best of this conference is the interactions that I'm having with all the different people from all the different sectors. And that is invaluable because we're all sharing, and we'll definitely, the more we share, the more we'll come back to some conclusions that will better our industry. Yeah, and that's really the take for me than really anything else, really. Because I don't think this conference was really to come out with solutions today, but really just to highlight everything and for us to have discussions around that.
Is vandalism and squatters a challenge for you? Because I know of a man, a 40-year-old man living in the hostels, and he's protected by students. So do you have such cases, and how do you deal with these?
There's several people living in the dorms that have nothing to do with the university. But also it's just the student squatters, because it's a health risk. It's a risk to sleep two to a bed. Those beds are not that big. You know, and you know, if there was a cholera epidemic in some of these universities, they would be wiped out. So yes, the squatter issue is huge, and it goes back to maintenance. The issue about decoupling the subsidy from the tuition side in terms of the student housing side, this is a policy issue that is very important to address, but most politicians, it takes a lot of courage to address this issue, because you really have to. Most of the public universities are doing it. The only way to figure out how much they're subsidizing is to go into their capital projects and their operating budgets and to see how much they're putting into the dorms and to compare that with the revenues that they're getting. So it's kind of it can be a bit complicated. It's certainly not transparent.
I would like to really thank all the panelists for the high quality of presentation and discussions till the end of this afternoon. For us, the organization of a dedicated housing conference for rental in Africa is a real first time on the continent. And I would like to congratulate Shelter Afrique team for this successful conference and the intense debates on such crucial issue for facing housing challenges in Africa. The first edition of this conference is a success. And as an active donor in this sector in Africa and in other parts of the world, we really expect concrete outcomes from the debates. We really encourage Shelter Afrique and the African governments and all the stakeholders to bring concrete projects and initiatives, like, for example, regulatory framework or affordable housing, social impacts for low-income people with social dialogue, private sector involvement with reasonable returns, so that could be presented to donors and commercial banks for financing. I'm proud that our institution is part of this housing conference for rental in Africa, and I would like to thank once again Shelter Afrique for associating our institution to this honorable initiative to develop affordable housing in Africa. I so declare closed this first conference on housing rental in Africa.
I really appreciate that Shelter Afrique brought together so many different stakeholders from the public and the private sector, the financiers, clearly some of the end users, and got them all together in one dialogue. I think that it's so unique when we're all in the same room together in a safe place where we can truly share ideas in a frank manner and try to get to the solutions, because what we all share in common is that this is an urgent need. Affordable housing is a crisis. You know, housing supply in Africa is a crisis. And so only when all of the different stakeholders come together and try to share ideas and come up with a common solution are we going to really push this forward. So this has been really fantastic.
But what is clear is that there's lots of rental markets which are functioning extremely well. And I mean, they themselves should be understood and in many instances celebrated, because they are giving people choice, really.
I think it's been a fantastic session, very enlightening, very eye-opening. It's valuable that I was able to hear various perspectives from various markets in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. You tend to get to understand the diversity in Africa, even though it's one region, but you know, the way things are being done in Kenya is different from Nigeria, it's different from Ghana, it's different from South Africa. Up until now, the rental housing market in Nigeria has not picked up. I was excited hearing what is being done in Kenya and what is being done in South Africa, and I feel there's a lot of opportunity for catch up, especially in the middle class segment and the lower middle class segment of the market.
The discussion on housing the last probably 10 years has been really on home ownership. Unfortunately, we've not done very well in that area, considering that we have less than 25,000 mortgages in Kenya, which means that essentially the Kenyan housing market essentially is a renting population, meaning that we need to invest quite a lot. There are huge opportunities in the rental housing market, and one of the things that stood out for me yesterday was the realization that yes, we talk about, for example, Nairobi growing, but unfortunately that growth is in the slums, and therefore we are just growing in the informal sector, but the formal sector is hardly growing, and therefore this conference could not have come at a better time. Home ownership is not the solution to the housing problem in Kenya. The solution lies in the rental housing market. The Kenyans in the Nairobi metropolitan area, they are paying about 30 billion in rent every month. That means for any investor who wants a stable investment in real estate has to think about rental housing, because that's where the demand is. So for me, it has been a real eye-opener, and congratulations, and thank you very much for Shelter Afrique for organizing this conference. I hope this discussion will continue from here, and it will continue to happen in the right places.
We are also going to follow up with a white paper which will be presented to the governments, both present here as well as the ones who are not here, so that we don't want this just to be a conference where people are discussing and talking, but we want to follow up with very concrete action. And we expect this actually to really turn into concrete policy action or concrete projects that will be aimed at promoting rental housing. So overall, it was a very successful event, and we are very pleased that we organized it. The timing was perfect.